The plan: Nigeria should establish a policy to combat poverty in the United States by offering the United States high-interest loans for producing economic growth on the condition that the United States federal government abandons federal protectionist measures and strict austerity measures. Again, Nigeria should establish a policy to combat poverty in the United States by offering the United States high-interest loans for producing economic growth on the condition that the United States federal government abandons the federal protectionist measures and strict austerity measures. Contention 1 is neoliberalism. Subpoint A, status quo politics of aid or root in U.S. coloniality to try and spread neoliberal ideology. The first argument is that in the past we have projected problems like poverty and disease onto other countries to give a public account of Western subjectivity, that we are fundamentally better than. Describing African countries as being poverty-ridden or constructed with disease or the origin of terrorism, etc., is the way in which the West has established itself in opposition to these countries, as though we do not have poverty or violence in our country. The second argument is that this process of colonial threat construction has been used to spread neoliberalism. There are a bunch of examples of this. Whenever countries in the 1970s before began to throw off the yoke of colonialism and begin to establish new forms of states, the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank offered these countries high interest loans that forced them to adopt austerity measures so that they couldn't subsidize domestic industries like dairy, agriculture, and other things that the United States and British countries produced, so that they would continue to be dependent on their former colonial dominant colonial powers. This has also been used in things like democratization narratives, where we said that we have to democratize these countries because they need Western values and Western governmental systems. This has been used to justify military intervention in the Middle East since the 1960s, and countries the world over, including in Chile with Salvador Allende, and a bunch of other countries where we launched coups inside these countries. The Bay of Pigs is the most famous example because it's the one that failed, but you don't often hear about all the narratives whereby the Central Intelligence Agency funded the attempt to take down leaders that were considered in opposition to Western interests, i.e. the spread of capitalism. The third argument, and this is supplemented by United States foreign aid and the status quo. It's based on the Keynesian theory that if you have debt between two countries, then they will become interdependent. But the truth is that has become unidirectional. Most countries are simply indebted to the United States as a result of these International Monetary Fund and World Bank policies. Has resulted in them being subjected to all of the interests of the West. This is especially true of things like foreign aid in Haiti and Egypt. We went to Egypt in 1972 when Hosni Mubarak allowed us to allow for food aid to go there. But the first thing we did when we got there is we killed all of their pigs under the guise of them being sick and diseased. And as a result, for every dollar of foreign food aid that we have spent in that country, they have spent $40 on United States imports, and it indicates that it is a process whereby we subject them to these kinds of things. That one was in 2007. Haiti was in 1972, but the same thing happened there. It gets pretty familiar. We burn their crops, and then they rely on the United States for agricultural exports. We're the #1 agricultural exporter in the world. This is especially true of austerity measures. You can look to places like Jamaica and Brazil for the impact of that on agriculture. In Jamaica, the local industries that had been under coloniality were forced to produce specific products for British merchants, and then afterwards the IMF gave them loans but said that they were not allowed to subsidize domestic dairy, which means that they collapsed their local production in favor of United States internationally shipped dairy. The same thing happened in Brazil. They were required to produce a lot of coffee and other soybeans and things of that nature in an industrial way, but they cannot produce enough food to feed their own populations, which is why there's simultaneous epidemics of obesity and starving in the world. It's not a question of food security, but rather of food distribution that's been affected by neoliberal politics of expansion. The CSU point is the impacts. The first is commodification. Neoliberalism necessitates the continued disposability of other populations. So long as you are caught within a machine in capitalism, you are ranked based on your productivity, both in the international community and at the individual level. This is an indication that when populations who are not considered productive become disposable. When ExxonMobil does things like spill a bunch of oil, but then say that they are updating their environmental policies until they spill it again inside the Yellowstone River, and also when they wipe out villages in Africa to be able to build a pipeline, is an indication that those individuals can be disposed of. This means that there is no value to life in the world of neoliberal neocolonialism. The second argument is environmental degradation. Neoliberalism requires an endless expansion, i.e. the David Harvey argument that the spatial fix of neoliberalism means that capital cannot abide a limit. It must turn that limit into a barrier that it then transcends. To be able to consume means that we will consume all of the resources on Earth. This will result in massive shortage of scarcity, but it will also destroy the biodiversity that the globe relies on. Earth life is is necessary to sustain Earth life. If you don't have food to eat, then you will not be able to survive, which means that we will eventually destroy the Earth once we get that 50% tipping point. The third argument is resource wars. I've already done a lot of the top half analysis of this about how we have to continually destroy resources. That means that countries introduced to the concept of scarcity by neoliberal capitalism will go to war over those resources because they believe that it's the only way they can feed their populations. This would ultimately escalate to nuclear conflict because great powers would launch those weapons to be able to get access to these kinds of things further. A fourth impact is civil instability. 88% of all battle deaths since World War II as a result of civil conflict in Africa, and that's more deaths than in World War I, but we don't talk about that because it's not considered a catastrophe, because it's not an event, it's rather something that continues. But additionally, this causes the next impact is systemic poverty and exclusion. So long as neoliberalism necessitates that there is a proletariat to be able to provide labor for rich folks who own businesses, then that will necessitate that other people remain in lower classes so that they can produce profit for others. The cease point is solvency. The first argument is that the plan results in the United States saying no, because we rely on things like subsidies for agriculture, renewable energy, social services, the military, infrastructure, fossil fuels, etc., that have made our economy jumpstart as an indication that the fantasy of neoliberalism is that we can handle being non-neoliberal, but other countries can't because it allows for us to remain and keep them dependent. That is an indication that when we say no, other countries will recognize that the United States is not committed to neoliberalism because it benefits people, but rather because it benefits the United States. The second argument is that this would break apart the fantasy. They would also say no because they have to be able to pay back their debt. We have more debt than most countries in the world, with the exception of India and one other country. Is an indication that we would also say no because we have to be able to continue to fund the way our government works. The third argument, that's critical to spill over to broader systems that combat neoliberalism, because it will allow for us to be able to recognize globally neoliberalism as a system is not something that even the West adopts. It's simply something that we impose on other countries. Contention 2 is framework. Subpoint A, the role of the ballot is to interrogate the relationship between neoliberal coloniality and violence. The role of the ballot is to interrogate the relationship between neoliberal coloniality and violence. The first argument is that oftentimes we approach policy with good intentions, but this often results in error replication because our good intentions globally are not necessarily resulting in good things. We should evaluate the methodology of neoliberalism. The second argument is that neoliberalism has funded super PACs and corporations to allow us to take over government and infiltrate what policies are and are not funded, which means analyzing that is a prerequisite to just taking should.
What's the order? One-off, solvency, case, or there's one off, the solvency flow, and then the app straight down, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. So I have all of that on one sheet, at the advantages on one sheet, so just let me know where
It'll be pretty,
So like solvency and then the app straight down, starting with neoliberal coloniality.
yeah,
Okay, cool. And then just framework on the bottom.
turns on bottom. Like this. Okay, alrighty. Clarity or speed's ever an issue, just yell at me. Anybody not ready? The Niger River gets its name from Leo Africanus, an Italian individual who waged wars throughout the majority of Africa, and eventually would write a book claiming the name of this river to be Niger, where he would refer to the people of Africa as being sexually deviant and incompetent intellectually. This history of colonialism continues to persist with this linguistic assumption of how this country has gone its name. We articulate it's fine. Counterpoint. The people of the Isabur River of Isabur should establish a policy to combat poverty in the United States by offering the United States high-interest loans for reducing economic growth on the condition that the U.S. actually abandons federal protectionist measures and strict austerity measures.
Can you give a text?
Yes, sir. The first argument is colonialist linguistics. In a world where we presume rhetoric is neutral and that the names that have existed in this place are static, we say that this is always going to create this us-them dichotomy, right? When the Western colonizer was able to move into a region and isolate and demarcate which territory should be named what, we say this is always going to be problematic. In a world where we have to combat neo-colonial identities, we're going to make the argument that it's always going to be preferable to actually analyze the way in which rhetoric, or we refer to these regions, refers to as. The second argument is that deconstruction relies on this knowledge. In a world where we don't understand the histories of these regions, it's always going to result in this idea where we pretend we're able to solve the problem while not resolving these underlying issues or these justifications that have resulted in the colonization of these regions. And then the final argument is that conditionality is uniquely justified in a world where we're indicting the AF on both an epistemological level and on a policy-oriented level. This is key to us being able to engage on both the theoretical underpinnings of the affirmative, but also engage with the affirmative substantially in the question review and framework. It's key to negative flex because we're able to engage on the AF on both levels. We say this is probably good in this instance.
Just a quick question. Is this the name that you would refer to them as the name that they were called before the Italian colonists did this, or this is like...
This is what we were able to locate as what the river was referred to as, and this river led to the identification of the region of Nigeria. So
it's the people of the river, not the people who live in like contemporary, what is
there,
referred to
there,
as
are,
Nigeria?
there are regional differences, yeah.
Okay.
Solvency?
Wait, which solvency?
Says yes, or says no. It's going to be says yes. We articulate that the United States is going to say yes a couple of warrants. The first warrant is that it's key to the expansion of the United States multilateralism, which is a form of neoliberal institutionalism. We'll articulate that the United States is always trying to expand its sphere of influence in a way it's able to more effectively integrate other regions. This is the underpinning of neoliberal institutionalism. We say that in a world where the United States says yes, they're able to foster more multilateral connections within these regions. This is evidenced by the fact when we signed the GATS or international or multilateral treaty on tariffs, which is probably against the United States interest, but we did it in ways that we were able to push forward. I've already taken your question. Push forward their multipolarity. We're going to say this is always. We're going to say that this means the United States is always going to say yes, even if it might be in their agricultural worst interest. But we're also going to say they say yes because recent studies have indicated that protectionist policies only lead towards food sovereignty, which is a movement where individual countries start to isolate themselves and rely on themselves for food security, and they start to reshape the way in which production occurs. And we isolate that this would be uniquely bad for the United States because it would dissolve our ability to have control over other regions via globalization, and the United States is aware of this because they're pretty good at being colonial. It indicates that they are most likely going to say yes in ways in a world where they're able to sustain their policies. Yours says no arguments are predicated off the fact that we have to pay away debt, but we say debt isn't a problem in the United States because of how high our GDP is and the fact that the dollar is perceived as the most stable investment in the world, which means that other countries are always going to invest in the United States debt because they believe that it won't have that inflation they won't deflate rapidly. Indicates that countries like China, Japan, and the Swiss are more likely going to be able to continue to invest in the United States debt, which means that the increase of debt isn't necessarily going to be bad, but more importantly, they're going to be able to pay back the loan because an increase in multilateralism for the United States will allow them to more effectively colonize the region and expand trade within these regions, because this would be the United States would view this as a stepping stone, and would view this as a stepping stone's ability to get more effectively in the region in the modern era, while also changing the way that the world perceives them, because they would isolate that in a world where they're accepting these high interest loans, other countries in the region will stop seeing them as colonial, which is a way they'll actually be able to more instigate this more nefarious colonialism that happens subversively, because they'd be able to expand globalization. And once they're deeply part of these economies, i.e., in a world where this region becomes dependent upon the interest paid back on these high interest loans, to then be able to make them capitulate to their demands, which would probably most likely mean that it would be in the United States' best interest and most likely result in the instances of neoliberal institutions replicating themselves. Yeah, the agriculture lobby is not going to be strong enough to prevent this because
Wait, what?
I'm thinking about that one.
No, what was the first part? Agriculture lobby?
Like the agricultural lobby or the protectionist lobbies in the status quo. Yeah, they're not going to be able to effectively prevent this because large fossil fuel oil companies will see the potential tapping on natural resources in the region once they gain more effective access, which means that they might front this as being a bad idea, but they'll ultimately be able to write with its currents. Most likely means they're not going to lobby as hard as possible to prevent this way, and will articulate that the belief that the expansion of multilateralism is always going to be preferable, is always going to be first in policymakers' calculus as opposed to as opposed to what the lobbyists are going to say, because they believe that because United States foreign policy is informed by a method of collective security, where they believe the more institutionalized we become, or the more interconnected we become, the more likely it is that we're going to resolve conflict, which most likely because we'll be able to create norms of interaction, which means that countries are more likely to go through normative channels of communication as opposed to take first strike in conventional warfare. We'll isolate that this is probably a reason why the United States, the people that make foreign policy decisions in the United States will probably think this is a good idea. Do you want anything else on this all team?
No, I think that's fine.
Alright, I lied. Can you go to the framework? We're going to articulate that A, the counterplan is going to be able to better meet the framework than the affirmative, because we also interrogate the question of linguistics and how these interact with our perception of individuals in the status quo. The way in which we refer to individuals is important. This is like instance by the fact that this is probably important. This is probably instigated by the fact of how after the Bracero program started between Mexico and the United States, it created the stigmatization that the Latino body could be viewed as disposable labor because of these policies, which just started to force them as becoming migrant workers as the Bracero program function, which then reinforced these dominant ideologies, probably indicative of the fact that understanding the way in which we label groups is able to then replicate norms, will articulate the counterparts that are able to resolve this, but we'll also say that the affirmative isn't able to meet their burden in the framework, because if we're winning the risk that it's in the United States' best interest to say yes, or that they will, if there's risk the United States says yes, it's probably a reason why they're not able to meet their framework, and probably means they're able to function in a more neocolonial fashion, probably means don't need a framework.
It's going to be the app in order. I'll start with solvency, the framework, then the advantage, then the counterplan.
Overview of the gap, the only arguments that you have made on solvency is that the United States will say yes, which means that all we have to do is win a risk that the United States says no, and we're automatically granted the solvency of breaking apart the fantasy of neoliberalism because you have conceded these arguments, which means we will go to the say yes, say no debate now. The United States controls the unilateral direction of hegemony, the unilateral direction of neoliberalism in the status quo. You've conceded these arguments that we're able to maintain this through our foreign aids and through the Keynesian economic system and through the indebting of these individual countries through the IMF and World Bank regulations, which means that we literally have no incentive in order to reverse this in the status quo, especially to a country that we exploit like Nigeria, but I'll get to that later, which means that you can go ahead and cross-apply all of that to their arguments. They say that this would allow us to expand our influence, but it would not allow us to expand our influence in the way that we wanted. In fact, would give Nigeria more influence over us because now would be a bidirectional flow of that indication that there's not going to be any propensity that the United States says yes to this. Additionally, there's a couple of instances in which we have said no. There's currently at least 6 pending IMF complaints and World Bank complaints against us, which we are not heeding an indication that if we wanted to just, allow us to expand our influence by being benevolent with these countries and allowing a bidirectional exchange of debt, then we would have already responded to these. But additionally, the second example is that UN regulations, which would allow us to have expanded our trade, which was the law, the Sea Treaty, and perhaps the Kyoto Protocol, whereas we could have interacted over things like green tech policy and global warming, which would, in their interpretation, allow us to expand our sphere of influence, would have weakened the United States significantly as the perpetrator of neoliberalism, the global system that we benefit from, which means that these arguments are a non-starter. There's not going to be a world in which the United States accepts these because we have, quote, accepted multilateral treaties on tariffs. Yeah, is that why we sanctioned Chinese steel in March of this year and put a 550% tariff? We ignore those arguments we ignore those agreements that we signed. Even so, there's no argument in which we say yes. But additionally, the next, you say protectionist measures are bad. Yet you've conceded the litany of evidence which indicates that we engage in protectionist measures over our dairy, over our grains, over our cotton, over our sugar, in order to remain artificially competitive over the former colonial satellite countries. This is the form of neocolonialism that we criticize that you've conceded. We are winning the uniqueness and the
direction of all of these advantages, which indicates that there's no reason why the United States would reverse the protectionist policies because we're currently benefiting from these. This is the bulk of the affirmative. You conceded that, which means these arguments flow our way. But additionally, the next argument, you say that debt is no problem. However, the debt to Nigeria would necessarily be a problem. But additionally, this jeopardy, you've conceded the unilateral flow of debt and power that we currently control, which means that even if it's a question of not debt, it is a question of power. But additionally, the next argument is you say that we'd be able to pay back the loan. You can cross-apply the above analysis. Your interpretation of globalization is not good because we want to increase their dependency of them on us. We don't want to increase interdependency. That is the lie of neoliberalism, that we're all interdependent, when in reality they are dependent upon us because of our use of neocolonial, neoliberal institutions. But additionally, the next argument, did you say fossil fuel companies would lobby against this and that would be significant to counteract the protectionist measures? This is a laughable argument considering that petroleum companies are the main exploiters of the Nigerian economy. They would lobby against this absolutely because then it would potentially disrupt their ability to exploit. BP and Shell do what is called enclave capitalism, whereby they build refineries and import workers from Southeast Asia so that the ethnic Nigerians don't necessarily have a relationship to them and won't rebel against the horrible conditions that these individuals are in. That is why the fossil fuel would be absolutely against this. But additionally, the next argument, you say that the people in the United States that think foreign policy is good would ultimately like this. Cross-apply literally the above of everything that I just said for the past 3 minutes as to why that's not true. The next, roll about. You have conceded that we are able to solve for the fantasy of neoliberalism by breaking it apart, which means we resolve broader structures of neoliberalism, whereas you would just not necessarily critique, us, which means we're the only ones that read the roll of the ballot. But additionally, you said that we'd have disposable labor populations. However, we think that it is necessarily essential compliment to refer to it as Nigeria?
Yeah. On the campus?
Yeah.
For like there being a federal government.
Yeah, we have to refer to them as Nigerian necessarily in order to have protections, and thus calling them anything else under the system of international law would allow for rampant neoliberal exploitation because companies would go in and say that, oh, this is an unrecognized territory that is not protected by any supranational laws, which are necessarily anti-neoliberal in their own sense, which would allow for exploitation ad infinitum worse. You say that it's in the United States' best interest. I've already answered all of those arguments. You can go to the advantage. You've conceded that we use threat construction in order to be able to invade these countries, which means that neoliberal wars of expansion are inevitable and that we use our positions in neocolonial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank in order to control this. You've conceded that we're able to solve this because we've won a risk of the say yes debate, say no debate, which is an indication that we break apart the fantasy of neoliberalism. That resolves for commodification, which is cold conceded. You can extend that across now in systems of neoliberalism. There is no invaluable life for these individuals, but you've also conceded 3 scenarios for extinction, which are environmental destruction, biosphere collapse, resource wars, as well as civil instability, which culminate in global catastrophes, which means that we're the only advocacy that's able to resolve for this. You can go to the counterplan now. We're winning the bulk of the offense. Counterplan doesn't solve for any of the affirmative, but we'll get to that. First argument is permutation due to counterplan. The counterplan is plan plus because it uses the entirety of the affirmative text with an additional word, which ultimately would indicate that this is plan plus. This means that it's theoretically legitimate, but additionally, the second argument is going to be that the first argument is going to be the historicity. This said the ace of point is that your presumption that returning to that name that was previously used as culturally sensitive option is retrograde view of the contemporary identity of these individuals. The BISA point is that this excludes folk who identify as Nigerian from the discussion of coloniality. It's like saying that Creole folks should pick one part of their historical identity instead of adopting their own identity. The CSU point is that your impact is racial, that the moral term of Nigeria means the history of Nigeria as it exists now and it's lost and ultimately forgotten because we call it something else in the world of the counterplan. The second is going to be the epistemology. This said the ace of point is that their belief that the historical challenge to coloniality language is radical results in a nihilistic deconstruction. The BISA point is that this results in endless academic questioning, that the Western process of desire to know the other and that the will to transparency and the totality of the idea leads to violent intervention as a form of curiosity, whereby we would deconstruct to know the radical and the exotic other as a way that we can project our purified self onto them as another form of neo-colonial violence. And the third argument is that word picks are ultimately colonial, that North American colonial schools that choose white names for indigenous focused Western determinism, that it denies their agency to identify how they want. And additionally, the fourth argument is that they don't solve the act that the people on the river are not included in the Nigerian government, which means that they would ultimately adopt the policy policy, and the fifth argument is permanent county plan. I cross-play that, but yep.
There's another argument underneath that says that the people on the east of the river includes populations that are outside of Nigeria, which means that it's larger than the plan.
Yeah, and that means that it's larger than the plan because it includes people on the other side of the river, which is another argument as to why necessarily the county plan is Plan Plus. But additionally, the next argument is you say colonial linguistics, and we have to determine what territory is what. However, colonial linguistics sidelines the issue because we would necessarily determine what neoliberal and neocolonial institutions maintained the 1884 Berlin Conference, which was what originally partitioned Africa up to the European countries so that they could colonially, extract resources from them, which is still maintained in the status quo by institutions like the United Nations and the ICC, which prevent the rebordering of these countries.
Do the IMF World Bank English programs, you can't return to history because neoliberalism is eliminated language.
Yeah, you can't return to history because neoliberalism has eliminated language through neoliberal education, i.e. like multinationals and processes like the IMF and institutions like the IMF implementing neoliberal education and Western education, which erasures the indigenous culture, which means it is impossible to return to the linguistic description that you described because it just simply doesn't exist anymore in most instances because of neoliberal erasure. And yeah, you have yet to meet the role of the ballot, which means that epistemiology and policy are relevant. You can go ahead.
All right, it's going to be overview, and then probably the counter plan, and then the framework flow, and then we'll do.
Can I get that one more time? I couldn't quite hear you.
Yeah, sorry, my bad. We're going to do overview, then we're going to do the counter plan, then we're going to do framework flow, and then we're going to do case.
Where do you want the overview flow?
You could just put it on the counter plan if you want.
Okay, cool.
Anyone not ready? Serious misunderstanding from the affirmative team that you're going to be voting negative in this debate round. First of all, it's kind of interesting. You don't read any floating pick theory bad. That's probably going to kill you in this debate round, considering we're going to go for the counter plan is a reason why the method of the counter plan could be a better way to solve for the affirmative, especially since we're going to win some defensive assolvency. We're going to win both the say yes and say no scenario, plus with some chance to stop more neocolonialism, means you're probably going to end up voting negative in this debate round. Kind of sad, actually. You're going to extend across our counter plan. First of all, you have to realize that the representations of this debate round is going to be key in order to gain us some more sort of internal access on the role of the ballot claim. They make a claim that we have to deconstruct neocolonialism, we have to deconstruct neocolonialism. However, they don't even respond to the claim that the method, the words that they're using in this debate round are the best way to do neocolonialism. You're going to see this because, one, we're going to go for fiat as the illusory argument. The only thing that actually matters in this debate round is what we say and how we say it, and the words that they're using are going to be the internal key to how they're perpetuating neocolonialism. It means that they're not ever going to gain any sort of internal solvency on their affirmative. It means you're always going to be voting negative for this. Max talks about this in his last speech about why colonial linguistics is going to be very important in this because it always creates an us-them dichotomy where now you have a very paternalistic aspect of what Nigeria is, what Nigeria does, and you're spreading neocolonialism in this debate round because you're like, hey, look, I know we oppressed you in the past, maybe we should alleviate on that oppression, and then don't answer the claim that Max makes, which says that it's that alleviation of oppression which causes more oppression. That's pretty damning for you. I'm sorry, but you don't get any internal weight on that in the PMR. We said that this is also key to the deconstruction of knowledge because it's going to be the history of the reason that's better. They don't have any impact on this claim. I'm sorry, you don't get it. The fact of the matter is we're going over you on this debate round. Even if you believe the ass is a good idea, that just means you vote on the counter plan. Sorry, that's like game, set, match for y'all. Cool. On the perm, you don't get a perm. You don't get the perm because you don't get to do intrinsicness on like, so two reasons. One, intrinsic perms are bad because you don't get to add good dialogue to make your bad dialogue worse. And two, severance perms are bad because you don't get to sever out of your bad representations of the debate round to begin with. Means that you're going to be voting them down on two specific instances on this perm and the way that they represent themselves in this debate round. They say that it's Plan Plus, but that's correct, but you don't even read the reason why that's bad, right? Like, okay, well,
They read it as a reason why the permutation is legitimate.
yeah, they read as a reason why the permutation is legitimate. We don't, okay. The permutation is going to be, actually, I don't have an argument on that.
Alright, if you don't have an argument, then you try to case.
Well, give me a second. We'll come back to that. Cool. Then they say history returning to retrograde is bad, but we're going to disagree considering that understanding the importance of knowledge and history is going to be the way that we best access and identify and beat out neocolonialism in this debate round. They dropped those claims from the counterplan in the LSE. Then they said that we exclude Nigeria from the debate, but that's just actually not true considering it's basically like look, we realize that we fucked up in the past, like, there has to be some sort of dialogue that happens in order to stop preventing neocolonialism. That means you're going to be able to be voting for negative. Then they say, then they put it aside, which is that it's historical challenge, it's nihilism, but it's not nihilism, it's just understanding that there's a problem that you're not rectifying for and actually cause worse neocolonialism. And it's going to say that it leads to endless academic discretion, but the fact of the matter is you're not doing any academic discretion because you're not talking about the past. We already identified that's an important key internal link on the counterplan, which they completely dropped. Then they said that like, we don't talk to earth people. That's not true, I guess. On Plan Plus, okay. We're going to probably just go for Plan Plus good. Plan Plus is going to be good because it allows us to have more in-depth debate, especially on neocolonialism, because when we get to talk about things like, this is going to be the key internal education. They drop the deconstruction of knowledge argument, which means that they're not doing enough in order to try to educate about what the topic is and what the topic surrounding the area is and what that means going forward in the future. Anything else?
Why don't they get a permutation?
I already had the intrinsic and the severance argument, and I said
But
that
like, if it's Plan Plus, why don't they get a permutation?
because of the representations of the counterplan. They don't get a permutation because they already fucked up the way they talked about in the 1AC. They don't have any sort of like rhetorical analysis on that. We say that the rhetoric matters and what you're saying matters. That's out of the counterplan, out of the LLC. They dropped that. Pretty sure we're gonna vote on it. Anything else we're gonna do?
Yeah, I need you to answer the fact that Nigeria and the East River are different regions, which is the...
Okay.
I also need you to answer the government legitimacy argument.
Okay, so I did answer the government legitimacy argument, did answer the river people one. Okay, so then they say that, okay, so they're talking about how they're two separate people. We're gonna say that this is an important first step into leading into the affirmative. Identifying like that there are different groups of people rather than just like postering them as Nigeria or the different types of oppression and neocolonialism that happened in the status, like through in the past, according to our Africana scenario, which they don't talk about at all, means that we're going to be we're the important first step to rhetorically engaging within the criticism of the affirmative. Cool. On to the role of the ballot. This is going to be pretty damning for them, considering that like we're both meeting the role of the ballot claim. You don't have to read it. Like, don't let them go for an argument that says that their framework excludes us because we're both doing the affirmative. We're just doing it better. They don't have an argument on why that would be bad. Just that like that means that we're going to win this debate round. Okay, you're going to extend across Matt's two arguments that the counterplan leads to the role of the ballot better, which is a way in order for us to like he makes this Latino body argument, extend that across, and they say that we say okay. They make a couple arguments on here. They say that. In order to solve that they solve neoliberalism, which is the reason why the role of ballot is true, we say they perpetuate it like worse, or at least the counterplan is even if just a fraction better than the method of the affirmative because we solve for at least a little bit more neoliberalism. It means that you have to vote negative on this. Then they say okay, cool. All right, we're gonna go down to the say yes, say no debate then. I think they don't do enough work on this flow. First of all, extending across Matt's argument that says that it's the expansion of the lateralism that causes them to more spread. The fact is, like, this is a very paternalistic act. Question.
Wouldn't giving up our nuclear weapons help us expand globalization in our sphere of
influence?
Okay,
the what we're arguing is what we're framing you as is saying that your method of saying, hey, look, maybe we do some good is actually just a covert attempt at the neoliberalism to spread itself. It's a turn on the case. We're saying that like you claiming to back off really just allows more things to fill in, like gas.
But saying yes results in more neoliberalism, so that's good.
Answer your question is no.
Okay. All right. Okay, extend across Matt's argument, the expansion of the lateral leads to a more spread of neoliberalism. We're saying that, okay, so it's like us leaving leads to more multilateralism, right? Which is this multilateralism that allows us to extend neocolonialism more. Am I understanding?
I need you to extend the food sovereignty argument because they conceded, and I need you to extend the fact that higher policymakers are in favor of collective security, and the affirmative is probably that.
Okay. They say IR, okay.
I need you to extend the food sovereignty.
Okay, extend the food sovereignty argument. This is going to be important because it's a concession straight out of the MG. Yeah, cool. And then the...
Can you extend the argument?
It's
the argument that protectionist policies lead to food sovereignty, which increases globalization. The United States doesn't want that.
Okay, protectionist policies leads to this is the agricultural lottery argument, which means that it's an extension of the multilateralism, which is a collection security, which is going to lead to comparative warfare, which they completely dropped out of the last speech.
I also interesting that IR policymakers believe in collective security.
IR policies lead to more collective security.
IR policymakers believe in collective security.
Okay, IR policymakers believe in collective security. That probably means that our scenario is just true when they're trying to lead expansionist policies.
It means they're going to prefer policies that are of collective security.
It means they're
more important than the lobbies.
It means they're going to prefer policies of more collective security. Cool. You're good.
Framework says yes, counter plan, there's going to be an overview on top. I'll go to order again.
Capital proposal separate sheet.
Neat, that works too. Is everyone going to do that?
You said it's framework says yes, counterplan?
Alright, framework says yes, counter plan, and there's going to be an overview.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if the overview is going to be that big though. Alright. Alright. Oh, framework page. Neat. Look, Nate is pretty good on this question in the MO. He indicates that the framework is a question of interrogation, or rather understanding the possible outcomes of these policies, not necessarily the policy itself. It's a question of how we're actually understand the language that we use and how it can shape possibly or inform our idea of the other, but also it's a question of what these possible outcomes are. That means that for some weird reason we're able to go for the pig and defense in this round. This is both a question of how the pig functions with the representations, but it's also a question of what the pragmatic outcome of this policy might be. We're going to be winning the representations, or are we going to reject them alone, reject them themselves, but we're also going to be winning that your interrogation is insufficient, because your interrogation would ultimately conclude you creating more neo-colonial policies. We say it's ultimately going to be bad and it's going to be a reason for the pick, because at least the pick, even if you're buying that fiat is real, is going to be able to resolve the question of linguistics, which means that the case is still going to be a benefit. What a case now. Look, Stephen does a very good job throwing out a lot of empirical warrants, but he's conceding two important claims. First, that the trajectory of the status quo and protectionist policies, especially in these regions, is towards food sovereignty, and that collapses the United States' ability to move into these regions and make globalization. He then misunderstands the articulation about fossil fuel companies. He makes the assertion that fossil fuel companies want to exploit these regions. This is probably a reason why they would lobby for the plan to pass, so they're able to continue to move into these regions, because in the status quo, they're transitioning towards sovereign policies that are going to collapse globalization in this region. This is probably indicative as to why the largest lobby in the United States is going to start to move towards passing the plan. This is sufficient enough. But you also can see there are...
Any mention of the fossil fuel lobby was not mentioned in the MO, I think.
I'm sure it's under consideration since it's a panel.
I mean, can you identify a place in the MO where you think so?
Possible.
I mean,
it was during the agricultural lobbying session.
Also, I think to some extent, this is just comparing the LOC claim to the MG claim. I don't think this is, I think it's just like Wayne for asking once.
I'm not so sure about that.
Me neither.
It's panel maybe.
It's fine.
Under consideration.
I'm at 223.
I have 130, yeah, 136 used, so yeah.
Alright, it's worried. Go ahead. But even if you're not buying that, you're buying the central claim of how foreign policymakers view the world. In the world where they view under this question of collective security, that means they're always going to want to move towards integration. That means that these lobbyist groups aren't going to be sufficient to push the United States over the brink, because they're always going to believe that they're going to be able to better integrate the region, which is going to be key to decreasing conflict as it creates normative patterns of engagement. This argument is literally not answered. Stephen raises his hand and asks a tricky nuclear weapons question to make it sound like this argument isn't new when it comes down to the PMR. It will be. Go to the camera plan. Look, you're making you make a lot of solvency claims and permutation claims. We're saying that you can't permute in this instance primarily because it'd be an instance of literal severance, severing out of language that you've conceded is a distinct difference, right? But you're also conceding the fact that there's also methodological importance, right? We're saying that the permutation probably doesn't resolve your role of the ballot, because you're saying we can just, throw like our linguistic choices out of the bucket. You're conceding the articulation that language is not neutral, probably a reason why the permutation fails. You only have one piece of offense here, right? This piece of offense is a question about how we retrograde history. The articulation that comes out of the LC and the MO is it's not our decision. We're saying that we should probably go back to a time before we create a colonial term for the region and then let the region figure it out for itself, right? This is not something that we should continue to impose. We should take a step back, refer to the land as it was before we colonized it, and then see what happens. This is an articulation, this is just a question about self-determination, right? We will use this term in this round because it's important to understand where these terms come from, how language is able to shape and demarcate borders. This is probably a reason why the permutation isn't going to resolve itself, and it's also a reason why this is going to be offense. The PMR is probably going to get up and wave their hands about something, how any defense we read on the case links to the pick, but this is the interrogation claim that comes out of the MO. It doesn't link, because it's a question of how we're interrogating these fundamental methodologies. Also, any risk of offense of the pick still means it's preferable to the counterplan. Look, don't let them go for the permutation. Or to the meaning. They can't survive the fact that they may have referred to the region by a colonial term, which probably isn't good. Probably a reason to negate.
Alright, so first I'm going to wave my hands on the app, and then I'm going to wave my hands on the pick. Okay?
Where are you going to start?
I'll start on the framework, and then the advantage, and then the counter.
Okay. Is that solvency on the bottom of the advantage?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I'll signpost where I work in business. There's an overview, just flow it on the framework sheet if you like.
Cool.
The LOR does write your ballot for you, but it doesn't mean you vote negative, it means you vote affirmative. If it's true it's a question of self-determination, then why do you get to choose that they should have to go back to a time before Nigeria? What about people who identify as Nigerian or Creole? How are they supposed to pick a part of their identity from a time that they are not from? You have conceded that your obsession with historicity means that you have entirely erased what has happened in between now and then. How are we supposed to know that it was screwed up to call them Nigerian if we completely forget the word Nigeria? That's why the permutation solves all of your offense, and the affirmative by itself is sufficient. Now the framework debate proper, your only argument is that you're doing the affirmative. How in this debate how they analyze the relationship between neoliberalism and colonialism? They've only talked about colonial linguistics. You have conceded all of our arguments on the pick about the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank influencing what languages still exist and what languages do not, which means that if that is true and you do not solve the affirmative, which you've conceded that you don't, then there's not a possibility for you to meet our role of the ballot. It's only important because their good intentions are, because our good intentions, dissent is conceded. It says that the attempt to try and help these individuals by saying that they should be this one particular thing is bad. If the permutation solves that, then I don't know what kind of offense they can garner in this debate. Now the top of the advantage, you've conceded all of our unanimous arguments that indicates that the status quo politics of aid is rooted in coloniality and neoliberalism, that the affirmative solves for commodification, 2 extinction scenarios, and civil instability in Africa that's been more deaths than the entirety of World War I since World War II is an indication that the affirmative is necessarily critical. If we win any risk of solvency deficit to the counterplan, then you should preface the permutation or at least preface the affirmative by itself, because we solve back for these arguments. Your only offense in this debate on the app is that individuals in the fossil fuel industry would lobby for the plan. First of all, I don't think this is in the MO, but also, this doesn't make any sense. We're saying that the government would have to get rid of subsidies for the fossil fuel industry that makes it possible for them to be competitive, which means that they would never lobby to get the things that they have lobbied for to go away. This is literally incoherent in the block, and it's also conceding all of our arguments about why the IMF and the World Bank were established in the first place, that we get dependency from all these other countries because they rely on us giving them aid, which is done through subsidies, which means that eliminating that would solve the plan. But also your yes argument is about how we expand multilateralism because we would be able to do some good as neoliberal. This is also incoherent. There's not a reason why the United States would say yes to getting rid of all of their subsidies, adopting strict austerity measures in favor of some high interest loans from Nigeria. It's an indication that there's going to be a break apart of the fantasy that we are in fact neoliberal in the United States, and that is what they should be moving towards, which means that the affirmative would solve the internal link claim that you say that fossil fuel industries would be able to get into these countries. They say they're moving towards food sovereignty now. I don't know why that prevents the fossil fuel industry from going into these countries, but also if that is true and they're moving towards food sovereignty narratives, then the plan would mean that they would not want to go there. They wouldn't want to go there now, but the plan would still solve for other things besides agricultural, i.e. fossil fuels, because they are not moving towards fossil fuel sovereignty. Yeah?
It could be like a floating state, but I don't think Stephen mentioned the words food sovereignty.
Yeah, because they said that we will never surrender this because we strictly subsidize our dairy, sugar, cotton, etc.
To compete with specifically places like Jamaica. That's been since the 180s.
I'm sure it's under consideration because it's a panel. And the yellow order is right again. This links to the counter plan, and you can't kick it for them, so there's no offense that's unique to us. Counter plan specifically. Every part of the MOC links to our historicity and our endless deconstruction dissent. First, your presumption that returning to the time that was before colonialism somehow solves coloniality from the interim is actually just a massive erasure. You say that we should go back to this time. How is it possible for those individuals who identify as Nigerian? You exclude them and you erasure the historical processes of coloniality that have happened since then when we started calling them Nigeria, which means that including the term is necessary. That means you vote affirmative regardless. Now, their colonialism linguistics impact is not generalized in the context of neoliberalism. They are not able to resolve the neoliberal spread because IMF and the World Bank will still force people to use English, which will erase their languages regardless. That the affirmative has a solvency deficit, which we do, which is that you are not the Nigerian federal government, you are the people of the East River, is an indication that they can't do the plan because they're not the Nigerian federal government. The Nigerian federal government is the one that has to offer it, not just the population that lives next to the river. The impact of erasure turns all of your offense because it means that the focus on history is bad. Or the epistemology dissent proper. You say that it's not nihilist because we're not doing any academia. Your argument is that we should endlessly deconstruct language so that we can be able to find out how this was colonial linguistics. If that is true, then you become armchair Western anthropologists trying to frame these individuals as a curiosity. This is a conceited impact that indicates that we will study them to try and figure out who they are and know them to be able to juxtapose ourselves against them in the future, which means that it only recreates coloniality in the future. These are massive impact turns to their methodological discussion of rhetoric as opposed to the affirmatives plain text that literally breaks apart the epistemological processes of neoliberal spread. Now, you have conceded word picks are colonial. North American naming of these individuals has resulted in indigenous folks being determined by the West and allows for us to be able to choose how they identify. If that is true, then that means you vote on permutation to the counterplan because you have chosen their particular name for the permutation to the counterplan does not sever because you are not just the affirmative, you are the affirmative and a bunch of other people. Their arguments about, that's right, let's just go back. Bring me outside, yo.